I want to welcome everybody here today. This is a really wonderful turnout for Texans in New York. This is fabulous. Thank you for coming. I'm Sally Clayberg. I am a 1966 graduate of the Liberal Arts College at UT, and I want to welcome everybody here, honoring our dean and all of his wonderful accomplishments and the professors he's hiring, and like Zach here, and anyway, we want you to have a wonderful lunch, enjoy yourselves in the conversation, and I want to introduce Dean Randy Deal, who has been Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at UT for the last 7 years. He has been at the university for over 40 years and came when he was 26 years old, is that correct? As a professor, he's in psychology. He brought his lovely wife, his childhood sweetheart, with him when they came to Texas, and they never left. And we're so glad Illinois' loss is our gain. Psychology was your background. And anyway, Ruth is going to say a few things about Randy, and then we're going to turn it over to him.
I'm just so excited to see everybody here. It's so nice to get a little gathering of Longhorns up in New York. And I want to make sure everybody knows just to go ahead and eat your lunch as we get going. This is kind of a lunch and learn situation, so dig in. And I'm going to take a moment to tell you that our dean is not just a great leader for the College of Liberal Arts, he's a leader on campus, and that we can be really proud of that. And in turn, the College of Liberal Arts has become a leader on campus. He's led us in recruiting for helping kids get out of school and get into jobs, and he's led us in improving the graduation rate and the four-year graduation rate in particular. He's led us in building new buildings, and he asked me not to say all that, but it's true, and we should be proud, and maybe he'll come up and say a few words. But enjoy and welcome. Dean Deal.
I have one more little surprise. If y'all will look under your butter plates, whoever has a little card that has a UT Longhorn on it gets a signed copy of our speaker's book. Hey, okay.
Sally and Ruth, I want to thank you so much for hosting this wonderful event at the Harvard Club. This is something that Mary and I always enjoy. Any reason to come to New York City, it will bring us here. We love it here. It's the 5th year that we've had this luncheon. Our very first speaker, David Oshinsky, has joined us today. He was here 5 years ago, speaking probably about his latest book. And it's a pleasure to have him here. It's a pleasure to see old friends and new friends. Again, thanks to all of you for coming. So before introducing our speaker today, Zach Elkins, just a few words. I was given probably more credit than I deserve by Ruth talking about leadership on the UT campus, but it is true that the college is playing a leadership role these days. And I just want to mention a couple of items. Ruth mentioned the 4-year graduation rate initiative. 2 years ago, Bill Powers invited me into his office, said, Randy, I'd like to move our current 4-year graduation rate from about 52% to 70% in a span of about 5 years. And he said, I'd like you to chair a task force that would lay out a roadmap for how we do that. And we took that charge very seriously. We presented him after about 6 months with a 130-page document with lots of data and analyses and a whole lot of recommendations. The good news is this report did not end up at the bottom of a file drawer. It is actually being implemented. How do we know that? Virtually every one of the recommendations has gathered its own little task force behind it to move it forward, to make sure it indeed gets implemented. And as a result of the implementation of those recommendations, this past year, UT had the highest retention rate in its history. Close to 94% of our first-year students were retained after the first year. This was despite the fact that the class was also the largest in history. Usually what that means is a lower retention rate. The fact that we had this historically high retention rate shows that the initiative to improve our four-year graduation rate really is working, and I'm delighted that it is. I want to mention a couple of other items. Just recently, Bill Powers asked the College of Liberal Arts if we would organize, if we would develop a campus-wide recruiting and interview center. Basically, he did this because our Career Services Office, run by Associate Dean Mark Music, is really the best on the UT campus. I would probably get some argument from other deans, but I can assure you that it is really a top-flight organization. And Bill understood that, and he has charged us with implementing a campus-wide, university-wide recruitment center. So tell your friends in the corporate world or the nonprofit sector that UT is open for business. When you come to UT now, it's not just to stop off at the Macomb School of Business. You can have access to all the other students, the wonderful, highly educated students that can add value to your company or your nonprofit. Last thing I want to say is, I think all of you know we're launching a new medical school at UT. We're all very excited about this. It's being done in the right way. It's not draining resources away from the core campus. It's being paid for by new resources, including, I must say, by the generous taxpayers of Travis County. But where I want to underscore what the College of Liberal Arts is doing, we are actually involved in all of the key committees. Liberal arts faculty and administrators are chairing committees and also serving on committees that are designing the preclinical and clinical curricula for the new medical school. And among the points that we are trying to emphasize is that we in the state of Texas have a really serious problem with health disparities, underserved populations. And the new dean of the medical school, Clay Johnston, and I have talked about this, and he agrees that he wants to involve liberal arts faculty in beginning to address the problem of health disparities and making sure that medical students at UT Austin are given plenty of access to underserved populations. This will become part of their training. So here again, liberal arts is playing a leadership role, and I'm very proud of what we're doing with respect to the medical school. So on that note, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Zachary Elkins from the Department of Government. Let me just say that we have this slogan, what starts here, what starts at UT changes the world. In Zachary's case, as you will see, this really rings true. His work is changing the world. He is a consultant on national committees that are redrafting their constitutions. He is an expert on how national constitutions can be constructed so as to have stability, to have some longevity. It is wonderful work. And just to mention, when he was promoted several years ago, it was on the basis of a book, The Endurance of National Constitutions, that will be given out, I understand, a signed copy, worth a lot of money on eBay, of that book, The Endurance of National Constitutions. So I think all of you probably have some kind of a Am I right about this? Where's Kathleen? So we're going to have a drawing. Is that how that's going to work? Okay. So something to look forward to. More recently, Zachary, with his co-authors, finishing a book called Designed by Diffusion, Constitutional Reforms in Developing Democracies. Among other claims to fame, he and his co-authors have developed this incredible website resource for constitutional drafting committees to find out what are the ingredients of successful constitutions. So this is something, I remember the last time I asked you to speak to one of our groups, you were about to head off to the UN to testify about how to get it right when you're drafting or redrafting a constitution. So I'm really looking forward to this. I'm sorry you're not going to be able to eat, Zachary, but it's for a good cause. I give you Professor Zach Elkins.
If you excuse me 1 second while I put this together, I think my wife's going to think the most pathetic thing in the world is the idea that my book would be a prize in a raffle. But I love it, and I actually grew up here in New York, in Westchester County, and excuse me while I get to the beginning of this, you get a preview. And it's really quite an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm just really deeply attached to the University of Texas and will be for the rest of my professional career, I'm sure of it. And I have so much to be grateful for to those of you who have made gifts or are thinking about making gifts to the College of Liberal Arts, because I can't tell you how valuable that is to the students and their education, to professors like me who use every dime of it for our research, and I think in some ways to the value of your degree. So I want to thank you very much. Randy Deal actually came to our department last week and made some remarks about the economic situation in the university. And I was reminded a little bit of Fidel Castro. This might be the first time you've been compared to Fidel Castro. Yeah, well, if you remember in 1991, at the fall of the Soviet Union, Fidel announced to his citizens that they were entering a quote-unquote special period, which is a great euphemism. And in some ways, I think the University of Texas is entering the same period where we can't necessarily look for the state legislature to fund everything we do. So I think everything that you do and outside support for the university and for our research is extremely valuable. I was just talking to Patricia Kelso, who is one of the benefactors of the chair that I am a beneficiary of. And I also have in the audience today Brett Perlmutter, who's my contact at Google. And he and Google Ideas, who I'll talk about in a little bit, has been incredibly generous in helping some of the research you'll see today get off the ground. And I can't tell you how helpful it is to have an outsider come in and actually add some sanity to an academic project. We have a new phase of the website I'm going to show you in a second coming out, and it's scheduled to be launched at the end of the second quarter. And when Brett was putting some urgency into our plans, I said, inside my head I'm thinking, Brett, we work on the semester system. What is this quarter two thing you keep on referring to? But nonetheless, it's nice to have some oversight from people who actually have different deadlines and schedules. Let's see. I want to start today by actually talking a little bit about our project. This launched about 10 years ago, and the idea was to collect data on the content of constitutions across the world and across time. Really every single constitution that's ever been written. So we had to go and perform this historical enterprise of identifying when constitutions were written, when they were amended, when they were suspended, et cetera, and then gather the documents, and then put together a conceptual inventory that allowed us to actually survey and understand those documents, and then do the hard task of actually reading them, which I've become a sort of a devotee of the constitutional literary form. But I can tell you that it's not always the most pleasurable thing to read. But fortunately, that's what graduate students are for. So anyway, we realized very early on that this project would be useful to drafters as well as scholars. Our first book, however, and this is the one that if you're so lucky you will win in the raffle, The Endurance of National Constitutions, actually co-authored with my collaborators on this project. And what we noticed right away in going through the inventory and the census of constitutions across the world is that there's a lot of variation with respect to how long they last. Obviously, we're living in a place that has had the same constitution throughout our entire history, but this is not true for every other one. Right after our book came out, the New York Times, of all places, produced this really nice graphic using our data. And if you can't read it, you can thank your hometown paper. But what you'll see, the larger bars are new constitutions, the smaller dark bars are amendments to those, and the faint lines you can't see are the periods in between. And what you notice, well, I'll just point out France here, and you might know the old joke about the French Constitution. Somebody goes into a library and asks for a copy of the French Constitution only to be told that they don't stock periodicals. Well, that's true for a lot of other constitutions as well. If you look at Latin America, which is probably the poster child for this, and of poster children, the Dominican Republic and Haiti are the poster children. It each had about 30 constitutions in their history, so averaging one every 7 years or so. They both obviously share the island of Hispaniola, and that island is responsible for 1/10 of the world's constitution. So I have it on my mind to go there to figure out what's going on. But suffice it to say, there's a lot of variation in how long these things last, and people are drafting them predictably on an average of 4 or 5 a year. Okay, now if you want to, here's some data analysis from our book, and this is a survival curve, which essentially allows you to get a sense of how many constitutions are alive at any given point in the life cycle. And if you want a measure of central tendency, you can look at the point that 50% of constitutions are dead and 50% are still alive. And if you follow that down, you can get a life expectancy of 19 years. So across this whole sample, the life expectancy is 19 years. What's interesting and somewhat eerie about that is the following, that there's a famous debate, also chronicled somewhat in our book, that you might be lucky enough to win. And there's a debate between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison that went on mostly by letters, since Madison was in the United States and Jefferson was in France serving as the first ambassador. Madison, of course, had sat down and written most of the Constitution, and Jefferson suggested, almost offhandedly, that the Constitution should be ripped up every 19 years and rewritten. And his famous phrase, "The dead shouldn't govern the living." In order to be more representative, each generation should write its own Constitution. Well, of course, Madison, having written the thing, you can imagine how he felt about that. But it sort of initiated this long-standing debate about how long constitutions should last from a normative perspective. But the eerie thing about that is that Jefferson suggested that they die every 19 years, but as a positive matter, in fact, that's when they are expected to die. So very strange. And there's more of those empirical nuggets throughout the book if you care to have a look at it. Now, I mentioned that there's a lot of data in the book that allows us to answer all sorts of historical questions and questions about the consequences of different constitutional choices. And as you can imagine, that's useful to drafters. One thing I've learned in my study of people writing constitutions is that their behavior and habits don't differ that much from the standard undergraduate. They're both working under tight deadlines. No academic work happens outside of deadlines. And they're late nights, lots of coffee, lots of, shall we say, incoherent prose. And so in some ways, I feel like have some expertise in constitution, but also have some expertise in drafting. And if you think about the drafting situation, we have people writing constitutions who are under really tight deadlines. It's usually a crisis situation and the remaking of a country's institutional framework. But it's also the case that these people really don't have much expertise at all. They've never, well, maybe if they're around 19 years ago, they may have written the other constitution, but for the most part, they're amateurs in this. And writing higher law, and they're trying to construct something that speaks to everybody in the country. and they're trying to construct something that's coherent. And we know how hard that is when you're drafting with 250 of your favorite friends and not so favorite friends, as the case may be in any legislature. So it's hard. And we wanted to build some tools to help. Now, I'm not sure, I said in some ways that the drafting assemblies look something similar to the undergraduate classroom. I'm happy to tell you that at Texas it doesn't look like this. Cell phone, asleep, looking menacingly at somebody over here, looking at the program, thinking about dinner. I don't know what's going on there, but it's not a lot of attention. And you know, lest we be so smug, obviously there's a reason why C-SPAN doesn't pan the benches during our legislative debates. So this is, in some ways, a difficult drafting situation. It's adversarial, it's inattentive, and writing is hard more generally. Let's think about what we can do to help them. One thing I should say we shouldn't do is to impose any of our ideas and principles. I mean, obviously, these constitutions are national documents, and they're supposed to enshrine national aspirations and principles. And certainly here in the United States, we shouldn't be traveling around the world, I don't think, necessarily imposing our own ideas. These should be indigenous products. At the same time, we've had 200 years of our history. We've had 150 years of political science. We have learned a thing or two about how to build institutions. And my sense is that political scientists should do a much better job of getting out there and providing some advice. I think we can identify or help sharpen their sense of objectives, what they want to maximize in their constitution. I think we could allow them to identify dimensions of any issue area. And one thing you're going to see when you read constitutional text, you realize how many different dimensions there are to any given problem. I think obviously we want to put out there some solutions that seem to have worked, predict the consequences of things they might adopt, and of course read, and help them edit their drafts. Now one assumption, and I'm going to tell you about a tool that I think helps drafters do this, and one assumption that we're working under is the following, that any writing exercise, whether it be the undergraduate essay that looks suspiciously like something you might find on the internet, or let's say a contract that an attorney might draft, or really anything that's designed, obviously they're working off templates, they're working off other models, and you have to get somewhat adept at actually adapting that product. I like to think about the analog of contracts, and constitutions, of course, are one form of contract, albeit in the form of higher law. And obviously, I don't know how many attorneys are in the room. I'm guessing a fair number. A few sheepish hands are raising. But obviously, when you draft a contract, you probably look out there and find other parties who have put something together that makes sense for them, right? And you adapt it to the parties that you're drafting for. I think it's the same thing for constitutions. We should certainly look to other constitutions and see what we can draw in terms of inspiration and into model text for them. One thing that is different with respect to regular contracts and constitutions is that constitutions are meant to be read, right? This is for citizens to understand their higher law, presumably, and our Constitution is written in a very plain style. We can read it, and I can testify that we can read the other ones for the most part as well, except for the one from Nigeria, for whatever reason. Inscrutable. You know, these aren't credit card contracts. You're supposed to read them. One thing that drafters want, I've noticed, is actual text. Yeah, they're willing to sit down and listen to you theorize extemporaneously about Montesquieu and Locke, et cetera, and all the political theory, but at the end of the day, they want some text. They've got a deadline, and that's the assumption we're operating under. So about a year or so ago, came in contact with some really interesting people at Google Ideas, which is a part of Google that started, I don't know, 2 years ago, Brett? So I'm going to introduce Brett Perlmutter, who's my contact at Google Ideas, which is based in New York. And Google Ideas, if you want to go on the website, does some really fascinating work. They're the ones looking at the degree to which there's censorship of the internet in China. They're basically taking Google technology and engineering and going onto the front lines of the developing world and helping solve some world problems. So a really phenomenal part of Google, and we've had the privilege of working with them. So my project, we know a little bit something about constitutions. Google knows just a little bit something about search, a little bit. And together we created this website, Constitute. I want to show you the launch video. For somebody like me, a launch video is pretty special, and I think it sort of captures what we're trying to do in Google. On the flip side, it also features me in the video, which is, as you can imagine, I don't know what the word is, horrifying to watch yourself on film. I've actually, does anybody speak German? I don't, but I did invent this word. We have a German exchange student living with my family this year, and we've got into the habit of constructing German compound words. Obviously there's some real gems out there that capture concepts that are just intranslatable in English. And I've taken a few. Does anyone want to take a stab at this? Yeah, Patricia got it. So the pain of hearing yourself. I don't think the word exists like that in the English language. I've just invented it. Our exchange student told me I totally butchered it, but I think that's more fun. But anyway, this is a short 2-minute video, and just by way of context, we had a launch, and this is what Randy was referring to earlier at the UN. Google put together this incredible launch at the UN that some of you actually, I think, attended. And in connection with that, we also had this video. And it tells you a little bit about what we're trying to do. Constitutions are very symbolic and they're very important. In many ways, they establish the principles and the ideals that countries aspire to.
It is a statement of belonging, of sovereignty. It is what makes a nation.
One of the basic things to constitutional drafting is looking across other documents. These are people who are writing under very tight deadlines, under demanding circumstances, and they need, in a very efficient way, to search and analyze a representative set of constitutional texts. Together with Google Ideas, my colleagues and I have put together Constitute.
If you are writing a constitution and want to know what African constitutions have to say about the rights of women after 1945, you can do that in just a few clicks.
The future constitution writers will use it. For citizens, having access to the documents is the first step to allowing them to feel ownership of their constitution.
Writing anything is difficult. Writing a document that's supposed to be the framework and the bulwark for democracy for generations is even harder. If Constitute can help that in even a marginal way, it'll be a success. So that gets more painful each time. I want to actually show you the website now and give you a very quick demonstration. As I mentioned, we put this together for countries presumably in the developing world who are writing their constitution, but of course those in Europe and elsewhere are thinking about constitutional redesign as well. Even here in the United States, we're thinking about it a little bit. And Sally, I don't know where you are, asked me for a little bit of material on the US Constitution. And the US is relevant here. I don't know how many of you read Justice Stevens' new book that just came out last week, in which he actually recommended 6 amendments to the US Constitution, which is kind of stunning in some ways. You wouldn't think a justice that spent his life adapting a constitution to the vagaries of U.S. culture and politics would see the need to actually rewrite the hard wiring of the document. But in fact, he has some suggestions. And I think maybe that sets a little bit of an agenda one thing that he suggested was that we do something about the balance of money and democracy, and do some thinking about how to strike the proper balance between, on the one hand, a very free exercise of your voice and your giving, and on the other hand, the idea of equal contributions and equal say in democracy. And so it's a tough balance that countries are obviously trying to strike with respect to that issue. And if you're sitting down and writing a constitution and you want to include something about campaign finance, what to include? Well, our suggestion with this document is that you think about the various excerpts that are out there from constitutions. We have in Constitute every single constitution that is currently in force, and we're always updating them to make sure amendments included. What you'll see in the left-hand drawer is our conceptualization for how the 330 topics that we've included in this website might be categorized, but you don't have to necessarily follow our conceptualization, and more on that in a little bit. You can just go here to the search bar, and let's put campaign finance, and it should auto-complete, and it does. And we see 37 constitutions of the 190 or so in our sample have said something about campaign finance. So if you're on a subcommittee, or you're Justice Stevens and you're thinking about redrafting higher law on this, you might take a look at these excerpts. We'll look at Argentina. And you can't read this, but you can see that the Argentine Constitution does two things. It actually provides for financial support for parties, so they don't have to raise the funds themselves. It also it suggests there be some transparency. So that's interesting. We're going to pin that, which means I can look at it later. Well, let's look at Angola since we're there. Angola does something a little bit different, and again, you can't read this, but Angola doesn't provide money, it provides access to airtime on the media, so that's interesting. We'll pin that. If you go down to, I study Latin American politics. Ecuador is one of the most interesting constitutions, the one written in 2008. They actually have a right for nature, not to individuals, but a right for nature. It's a very sort of environmentally friendly constitution. So it's full of all sorts of modern devices, let's put it that way. So with respect to campaign finance, they have a few interesting things here, but one thing they do is prohibit the use of the state infrastructure and the state employees from politicking, so that's kind of interesting because we know how powerful the bully pulpit is. Let's just do one more. If you go to Mexico, which is always interesting, and in this case, it more than you would think, Mexico is a very detailed constitution. It's constantly being amended. With respect to campaign finance, they have an incredibly elaborate formula for how much each party would get in a national election, so I'll just read it to you. Public financing to support their ordinary permanent activities, this is of the parties, should be fixed annually, multiplying the total number of citizens registered as voters with 65% of the daily minimum wage in the federal district. 30% of the amount calculated as previously described shall be distributed among the political parties on an equal basis, and the remaining 70% in accordance with votes and blah, 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 blah. So, okay. Most people in their constitutions don't want to get that detailed, but certainly Mexico has. Okay, so I pinned that, and you can see all the excerpts that I've pinned for analysis later are here on this right drawer. And obviously you wouldn't want to read them here in this narrow window. One option is you can download these all into a PDF, which is one option. But I want to highlight another one we've just introduced, and that is, and this is the beauty of working with Google, is that you can now take these pinned excerpts and transfer them directly to Google Docs. So for those of you who don't do a lot of collaborative writing, Google Docs is a fabulously useful way to collaborate real time with co-authors, and something that presumably drafters should be doing. So if we export that, it'll send the data, and depending upon your internet connection, you should have that document right there in your Google inbox, and sure enough, there it is. You can see all the ones that I just pinned. And if you're on a subcommittee and your charge was to do some search and analysis of all the world's constitutions on a particular topic, you've just accomplished that in 5 minutes. And now you can go home, hang out with your kids, or get some sleep and do something really important. So this is changing, I think, the way people are leading their lives. There are other aspects to Constitute, and a few new things we have on the horizon. But let me talk for a second about collective drafting, because we've just imported this into Google Docs, and most of you probably have cooperated or collaborated on some written document at your work or in school, and you know how hard that is, and you know the classic pathologies of collective action problems and texts that don't represent the author's views, and micromanaging and bruised egos and everything else that goes with working collectively. We don't have a good way for people to write things collectively. The standard two practices are to carve up the labor and have people come back with a section of the Constitution that they'll staple together, or to have a number of people, including fierce adversaries, hover around somebody with a laptop and craft sentences, which you can imagine is not a good way to do it. Google Scholar represents a much easier way, I think, sort of a machine-mediated way to write. And right now we're doing some experimentation to see what happens when people write constitutions with Google Docs. I'm doing some experimentation right now with undergraduates. As you can imagine, undergraduates could really not care less about constitutions. And so asking 5 of them to sit down and write a constitution with Google Docs, and another 5, the control group, to write a constitution as they would normally, not many ideas are flowing. So at the suggestion of one of my Plan 2 students, we had them write a roommate constitution. So all these undergraduates, of course, living together the first time, living independently, going through all sorts of interesting shenanigans in their homes. So having them sit down and actually write out the rules for how roommates are going to live together, as you can imagine, they had a lot of material. I had no idea. There was one group that had 2 pages under the section of nocturnal visitors. More than you want to know about your undergraduates, certainly. But the results from the early experimentation is that they enjoy the process of writing on Google Docs. Not surprising, they're Generation Z or Z plus or whatever they are. So it's a much happier experience for them. It's much more representative of the views of various co-authors, and it's much more shorter. It's shorter and it's more harmonious. It's a cohesive document. So more to say on that. That's a direction we're going. I want to just completely and utterly geek out for a second and talk about what's underneath the hood of Constitute, because that's really one of the most novel things in this document, or in this data set, in this project, I should say. Most of you do this every single day probably, but let me put something in here. I'm going to say things to do to auto-completed. That's nice. Okay. So I have another day. Maybe I'll take them up on this. Now, one thing you notice this is new in Google as of a year ago. Year, right, Brett? Knowledge graph? Okay. So you notice now with searches that are actually popular searches, you get a carousel at the top, which is rank order of all the great things you can do in New York. And I actually use this all the time. But you also get what's called the knowledge panel here, all sorts of aspects of New York City. And that's great. Not everything has this, but everything on the internet has data behind it, and it has this very special kind of data. And let me show you that for a second. I've been working with data for years and years and years, and obviously we put data together and merge political and economic data to say interesting things, and this is your typical data set, rows and columns of data. But the data that's underlying Constitute and knowledge graph, the Google search, is very different. Instead of a flat file where I have countries and attributes of countries in columns, in a very wide column, the Constitute data, and I told you I was going to geek out here for a second, but the Constitute data is really long, and every single piece of data is a URL. And you can't read this here, but every single country in the Constitution its own URL. These are what's called triples, a subject, predicate, and an object. And this is what's called the knowledge graph. Every single thing, every single entity out there on the internet has its own dedicated URL. And you can think of a sort of a much more, not a flat data structure, but a data structure that allows you to pin in and just grab concepts, grab topics, and in a very standardized way, take all the internet, all the data that's underlying the internet. So for example, Wikipedia I don't know if you know this, all those articles have underlying them a set of data that looks exactly like this. All the objects that people write about in Wikipedia are this kind of semantic style data, and it allows Google to take the DBpedia data and produce the knowledge panels. So I have a challenge for Brett. This is a surprise to him. All right, so yeah. Challenge and a surprise. So obviously New York City has its own knowledge panel, and things to do in New York City is a concept that people might be interested in. But I don't know. Let's think about the Constitution of Venezuela. Brett, do you think that has its own knowledge panel?
It's in the knowledge graph, but it might not have its own.
I don't want to hear excuses, Brett. There's no knowledge panel here at all. None. Google has our data. They have the possibility of actually reproducing all sorts of interesting information about Venezuela right here and in the Constitution. And the question, obviously, knowledge graph is so wonderful because the information is curated and not everything that they have information on is going to go in the knowledge panel. But my hope is that within the next year, we will be able to see the Constitution of Venezuela as a knowledge panel. So I'll share Brett's email, and you can all email him if it doesn't happen.
We're going to work on it.
Okay, good. All right, so let's see. The other really interesting thing about these data, and let me go back to Constitute for a second. I often wonder what we as academics can provide our students in the classroom. Obviously, they have all this information in front of them and they can learn on their own. And I'm a strong believer in do-it-yourself learning. On the other, so what do we offer them? I think the one thing we offer them is a conceptualization of the world out there, a set of categories that helps them actually make sense of these empirical phenomena. And in the case of Constitute, we have that in the form of our curated topics. We have these categories on the side, and you can drill down and look for every single kind of right you'd ever like and look for things that way. But we know that categorizations often tend to be kind of one-dimensional. And what do I mean by that? If you think about the Linnaean classification system for nature, there are all sorts of boundary cases that don't seem to fit. So the duck-billed platypus, yes, it's a mammal, but it lays eggs, has a bill, and has a beaver tail. Should we put it under the mammal classification? I don't know. Curling, is that a sport? No offense to those who do curling. Olives, technically, yes, that is a fruit, but not really, right? And so here we're getting to some really interesting aspects of how we conceptualize categories. And cognitive psychologists, and Randy Deal is among these, and many of you don't know that in addition to being dean, he's one of the foremost experts in cognitive psychology and understanding how visual and audible stimuli are categorized naturally by our brain. But in addition to these natural categories, we as scholars are imposing these categories. And we want to do so in a way that doesn't assume, this is a very, what we call a classical categorization scheme, in which each element is a full instance of this concept. That is, there's a definitional attribute, and it satisfies that definition perfectly. But we know with olives and curling and all the other boundary cases that there's other ways to conceptualize these things other than our categories. And the great thing about these data is that you can search without doing any of our categorization scheme. So for example, we don't have a category called women, but when you type that in, you see a bunch of topics that have something to do with women. Now, how did we do that? We built this thing called an ontology, which is a data set that represents all these concepts and what they mean to people. And you can actually edit that ontology here through this protocol that Stanford University has developed that allows people to add dimensions and categorize, in our case, here are the topics, you can't see this, but for our constitutional database, add keywords and classify things in different ways so that, and we use this data file underlying here, so that when you go back to Constitute, you can use that conceptual architecture and search in a much more powerful way. And this is I think we're the first political science data set to ever put our concepts and our things, our data, in this semantic style that allows for really powerful searching, and but we're not the last. Everybody else is going to go this direction, and it's a really interesting development in social science data and in regular data. Okay. I think I'm done geeking out, and I want to tell you a little bit about where we're going with respect to Constitute. Because I mentioned out the front that Q2 is approaching, and that means there's a deadline, since, again, we're not on the semester schedule. Reading these constitutions should be done in your own language. For those writing constitutions in Arabic-speaking countries, they should be doing it in Arabic. We have Arabic Constitute that we're building right now that's going to launch at the end of Q2. I'm loving this Q2 thing. So we're hard at work on that. In fact, Brett and I are going to spend the rest of this afternoon talking about that. We hope to do this in Spanish as well. We're also in the process of putting historical constitutions. One of the great things about our data set is we have these constitutions going back through time, and scholars, at least, if not drafters, should benefit from all these historical documents. So we're in the process of putting these up. And again, this is Arabic, but I don't know if you can see here we're developing some software that allows you to compare constitutions side by side. So Egypt, as you know, has been pretty prolific in constitution making in the last 20 years. They've had 2 in the last 2 years. So this is a graphic that allows constitutional drafters in Egypt and elsewhere to compare the 2013 to the 2012 to the 1971 Constitution. And you can pick any topic and then see where in the text that topic shows up, and then see the actual excerpt on that topic in this window right here. So it's a really great tool for historical analysis of documents. We're, as I mentioned, putting together some drafting tools that help people write together. We have all sorts of data analytic tools, and this is where we as political scientists get really excited, all the really cool ways to visualize these data and show them. We're taking Constitute on the road, and this is another thing Brett and I are going to be talking about in the next 2 days. We've identified 20 or so countries that are poised to write new constitutions, and we're setting up a schedule over the next 6 months or so to visit at least 4 or 5 of them. We'll probably be in Myanmar, in Libya, Chile, Brazil, among others, setting up workshops for people writing constitutions, showing them this tool, working with them, and also, in addition to showing them, we're also going to do some measurement and evaluation. We want to see what happens when people write constitutions with Constitute. What are the consequences? I think it's a great tool. Other people seem to suggest that they find it helpful. What happens when you actually do some real experimentation to see people writing constitutions with this tool as opposed to another way? So we're going to set up a laboratory in each of these situations to have people actually sit down and write constitutions. And it could be that when they sit down and do this exercise, maybe some text will come out of it. So we're going in the next 6 months or so around the world to do this, but we're also going down the road to Philadelphia, to the National Constitution Center. So I've been developing this project with the director of the National Constitution Center, which is a fabulous resource right there at Independence Hall. And there's a great museum devoted to the U.S. Constitution. And we are putting together, and get this, a museum installation version of Constitute, together with all sorts of other sort of infographics that allows kindergartners and up to seniors to play with these data in a really innovative way. And we're doing this with, I don't know how many of you know the Texas Advanced Computer Center. This is one of the great things about being in Texas, is that you can go down to the building right next to you and find somebody who's at the forefront of their field. And the Texas Advanced Computer Center has this visualization lab where they have jumbotrons the size of, you know, the McComb Stadium, our stadium's jumbotron, where you can, basically a big iPad where you can play with these data, and whether it be engineering data or science data or constitutions data, it's a great way to interact with this, with these data. And we're setting this up in the museum in October 2nd. Short trip down. I've plotted this at Google Maps. I'm all about Google these days. Hour and 22 minutes. on the train. October 2nd, we will unveil this at the National Constitution Center. So hope to see you down there, and maybe we can let people know. I think that's all I have to say, except for welcome.